It seems like we have been forever, at least to me, since last we were together. I'd like to say I have your handouts from 3 weeks ago, but I do not. We are going to make arrangements to change that.
You missed us, is what you're saying.
Well, yeah, I did. I mean, you may not have noticed, but this is what I like to do.
It's been a good class, we've enjoyed.
And I appreciate the fact that there are people that are interested, that want to be here, whether there are 8 of us here or 80, doesn't matter. So I have missed it, yes. Let's have a brief word of prayer, and then we'll start. Lord, thank you for these committed souls, and just help us to gather something that touches us or makes an impact on the way we look at things, the way we think about things, because we're talking about the same church that exists today. In Jesus' name, amen. I had said back however many weeks ago that it was, that we would have 2 more classes this week and next week. I lied. There are going to be 3 tonight and 2 more. And it's because I have said all along, probably ad nauseum, that I have to cut this down really sharply or we'd never get through it. We were talking this morning in choir. I said, we could take a year or 2 to adequately cover this. But there was one part that I was leaving out that I thought about it, and I said, no, I gotta include this. Because it's probably the most insidious thing that the Roman Church ever perpetrated on unsuspecting believers. In 1540, I'm going to pull all this together because we're going to kind of jump around a couple of decades here. In 1540, there were some Spanish priests and students, primarily led by Ignatius of Loyola, Francis Xavier, and Peter Faber. This is the dear Mr. Ignatius here. May as well show them all 3 while we're here. This is Ignatius, but we have 2. And this is Francis Xavier. Bear in mind, as we go along, that he was canonized, as was Ignatius for that matter. These gentlemen, with 3 or 4 other folks, decided that they wanted to take the church. I won't say the gospel because that's not what they were doing. They wanted to take the church to the Muslims. Okay, that's a very laudable thing to do. They went to try to go to Jerusalem, but while they were traveling, there happened to be a very serious war going on between the Christian nations, or the West, and the Ottoman Turks. Of course, they were Muslim. Now, in my mind, if you want to take the church to Muslims, you're going to find all kinds of Muslims in a war. I mean, there are going to be plenty of Muslims to talk to if you last that long. But these folks decided to turn around and go back to Europe. And they went and they, next one out, went to talk to Pope Paul III. And there they dedicated themselves to anything the Pope wanted them to do. They would be the Pope's soldiers. These fellas came to be known were the Jesuits. Pope Paul decided that what he really needed were some people to root out heresy in the dominions that were propagating Protestantism. There were a lot of recruits for Ignatius to draw from. Now, in fairness, Xavier, he went to the east, the Far East, and there he took the church. I'm not going to say he took the gospel because that's not what the church taught, but he took the Roman church to Xavier, to the Far East. Peter Faber, he hung around, he kind of dropped off the vine, but the motivating factor was Mr. Ignatius. And he started gathering recruits by the hundreds. Now these recruits, every prince, every general, every king, there was of a popish mindset, a papal mindset, had a following of Jesuits that would hang around with them. Generals in the field had their group of Jesuits. Kings and princes had their counselors of Jesuits around them. Why was this? So that whenever they ran into a hotbed of heretics, the Jesuits would know what to do. There were probably more people burned, beheaded, tortured than any other single group by the Jesuits. They were soldiers of Christ in their minds. The interesting thing about it now is we look back on what they did and we come to realize that they had nothing to do with Christ whatsoever. But in their minds, protecting Holy Mother Church was the driving force. And they had committed themselves to Pope Paul and his service, and he authorized the order of the Society of Jesus. Now from here on out, up through to almost 1700, anywhere you went in the world, even when Protestantism was more or less authorized in various areas, legal, if an Englishman, when the English finally got to the Far East in the early to mid 1600s, the Jesuits were already there. And the Englishmen had to watch their backs because the Jesuits were always plotting to either do them in or to make them look bad to the Japanese, the Chinese, whoever they were trying to build a trade relationship with. They were very devious and cunning people. The reason I bring them up now is because they're going to play a big part in what we're going to talk about tonight. Charles V, if you go one more slide, please, Al. Charles V at this time, 1519 to 1556, was the Holy Roman Empire, or Emperor. Now this hadn't meant a whole lot for a number of years. In fact, maybe since Charlemagne. So for nearly 700 years, the Holy Roman Emperor was more a political title and a person that tried to hold all this together. But by the time Charles V came along, who was from Spain, he literally had physical control over all of this. The only separate entities were were France and England. Otherwise, he militarily controlled all of this and could call on all of these areas to provide him with soldiers, whatever he needed to put down heresy. His primary role was just that. That's what he considered. Now also bear in mind, and I don't have a slide here, but also bear in mind that he also had control over all of the new discoveries in America. The gold mines of Central America, South America, they all belonged to him. Charles V was feared throughout Europe because he had the type of clout that nobody had had for centuries. He called the shots. Now Charles was an interesting fellow. He was Spanish by birth. For all the time that he ruled, he never had a capital city. Never had a capital. Because he spent all of his time traveling in his domains. All of the time. And it took that, in his mind, to hold them together. He did not have a home. He did not have a capital. He ruled literally, in his own right, Germany, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, and had control of Austria. He himself. During that time that he was Holy Roman Emperor, he spent 28 years up here in the Netherlands. He spent 19 years he spent 9 years in Germany and 18 years in Spain. Going between. And there's a reason for that. Now, we haven't covered it. I don't want to say it's a sideshow, but because there were tens of thousands who died, but he spent a lot of his time up here in the Netherlands. And he was up there because the gospel had taken root in the Netherlands, and Sweden, Denmark, what would turn out to be Finland, Norway, they had all become staunch Protestants. It took Charles 19 years, 18 years, up in the Netherlands to try to destroy Protestantism. He spent that much time up there, and he very nearly succeeded. Tens of thousands of people went to the gallows, or the stake, in the Netherlands. Now, he didn't have anything to fear in Spain, because there had always been an inquisition in Spain, pretty much. Protestantism never had a chance to take root in Spain. From very early on, they were attached to the church in Rome, and from very early on, everyone's heard of the Spanish Inquisition. They had their very own, who kept control over the populace, and anytime it was like a game of whack-a-mole. Anytime any Protestant ideas started to proliferate, the inquisitors were right on top of it. Never had a chance to take root. So he really didn't have to worry about Spain, or what is now Spain, so much. Occasionally, he had various areas of Spain, Aragon, there were a number of different areas that comprise what is today Spain, and he would have to go to sea after that, because there might be somebody that did not want to play ball or something like that, so he would have to go and take care of that. The 9 years he spent in Germany, guess what he was doing there? Killing whatever Martin Luther had established. And again, he very nearly did. In fact, Germany probably fell off the Protestant wagon more readily than anyone else. But we'll get into more of that next week. But it's important to understand, because what all this is leading up to tonight is I was going to skip over how Henry VIII is considered a reformer. But I decided I didn't want to do that, because Henry's a fascinating fellow. But I wanted to give you some background of what happened prior to Henry and the Reformation in England. All of this was going on. The Jesuits were here. Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor. He had control over all these areas. Now, Henry's dad, well, let me carry on. I'll just fast forward with Charles here. Charles, at the end of his reign, well, it wasn't the end of his reign, Charles abdicated. 40 years of his reign was incessant warfare, either against the French, Protestants, or Turks. I suspect he was tarred. He was tarred. I'd like to think he abdicated because he had a guilty conscience. But I don't think that was it, because he abdicated his throne, all of his thrones, and retired to a monastery to live out his days in peace and quiet.
Was that a Jesuit monastery? Was that a Jesuit?
No, it wasn't. I believe it was an Augustinian monastery, actually. But
Hopefully someone came in and killed him.
he died in his bed.
Who's next?
But he left, he split his kingdom between his son, Philip II, and his brother, Ferdinand. You know what I mean. First,
Right.
Ferdinand. Ferdinand pretty much took over this, and Philip took over this, including the holdings in America. Charles, bless his pea-picking heart, was a piker compared to his son Philip. He was an amateur compared to Philip. Philip contacted, who was Pope by this time? Sixtus V. I don't know what's next. I can't, oh wait a minute, I got it here. Okay. No, we're not there yet. We can stay here. Philip contacted Sixtus V, was Pope by this time. Philip contacted him and said, "My sole goal in my reign, however long it may last, is to rid the world of Protestants." And boy, he gave it a shot. With the aid of the Society of Jesus. Okay? We'll come back to Philip, I guess, or whatever. This handsome gentleman is Henry VIII. Henry was the son of Henry VII. Excuse me. And Elizabeth of York. He had a brother, Arthur. Now, if you think back to that map that we had up there, every area was dominated by Charles except France and England. Okay? Now, France was ruled at that time by Francis I. Francis was a very jealous fellow, not to mention the fact that he had Charles right on his border. He had nowhere to run. So he was constantly sparring with Charles. England, Henry VIII's dad, Henry VII, had a hard time consolidating his kingdom because there were a lot of rival claimants to the throne. So there was some civil war that went on, and Henry grew up with that. He grew up with the tensions and the anxieties that came with not knowing if you're going to win or lose and keep your head or not. So when he came up, the English way of neutralizing Charles was to marry into the family. They wanted to buy some time to consolidate England, to let the civil wars rest. So they contracted, Henry VII contracted a marriage alliance between his son Arthur and Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was only 5 years old when she was betrothed to Arthur. I think it was five or six, something like that. Very, very young. But that helped keep Charles away from England, so they could live in relative peace. Henry, for all that he went on to do, was not a bad king. As far as society in England was concerned. He tried his best to give more and more freedoms to his people and to make them law. However, eventually Arthur grew up, Catherine grew up, and they got married. 5 months later, Arthur died. Now, Catherine went to her grave insisting that the marriage was never consummated. Henry, partially at least, to maintain that alliance, or that stay away from us, I'm part of the family, with Charles V, went to the Pope and asked him, because it says, thou shalt not have thy brother's wife. It's not a Ten Commandment, but it's in Proverbs and Deuteronomy. Henry went to the Pope, because the Pope, of course, is God's representative on earth, and said, Pope, I want to marry my brother's wife, Catherine. Can you make that possible for me? Well, of course, Henry. At this time, young Henry was a very staunch Roman Catholic. Very staunch, and bought the church. I mean, he was a Roman Catholic. He asked to be able to marry Catherine. I think I've got a picture of Catherine, don't I, Al? Maybe I don't. No,
And you
no.
got Mary.
Okay, yeah, we'll get to her. I'm sorry, I did not get a picture. But, and the Pope gave him permission to marry Catherine. Sure, bud, no problem, go ahead. Because it was in the Pope's interest to try to maintain peace as much as possible in Europe as well. When there's war, the church ain't making no money, because the crops are burning up, the peasants are being killed, maybe even a church or bishop gets burned down or killed. It's not in anybody's best interest to have wars going on. So to keep the peace, Pope said, sure, go ahead, you have my blessing. Marry Catherine. And Henry did. Henry becomes king, Catherine becomes Queen of England. Now the problem with this was, the English people loved Catherine. Even though she was Spanish, she served the English people. She did a lot of wonderful things for society, and not just the elite, but the average English man and woman. She was greatly beloved. But after 11 or 12 years of marriage, there was no issue. And what I mean by that is specifically no son. And in this, now bear in mind, think of how Henry grew up. The anxiety, the tension during those civil wars, the never knowing whether his dad would be defeated, and some soldiers would come rushing into their palace and kill them all. Henry did not, for the sake of his people, want that to happen again. So now, interestingly enough, he realizes that the reason he hasn't had a son is because this marriage was wrong in the eyes of God.
Excuse.
It was wrong in the eyes of God, and God was cursing him. So he went back to the Pope. Now, along the way, he also happened to become infatuated with Anne Boleyn, who happened to be a not a chamber, but a lady in waiting to Catherine, his wife.
Just so.
Just so. Interestingly, Anne was a virtuous young woman. She would not have, obviously you're not rude to the king, but she rejected his advances. She said, you have a wife, and I am her lady in waiting. This ain't going to happen.
It'd be betrayal.
Yeah, this isn't going to happen, Your Majesty. It just isn't. Well, Henry said, we'll see about that. Eventually, and this is interesting because Henry, because he said that he wanted this marriage annulled because it was against the Word of God, sent out to all the colleges and universities, to the educated elite, and asked them what their opinion was. Interestingly, the vast majority of the Catholic, the Roman elite, agreed with Henry. Said, you should not have had your brother's wife. Now, think about this. The Pope gave him the dispensation, and the Pope is infallible. Now, all these guys are saying, no, you shouldn't have had Catherine for your wife. I don't know if they thought of what they were saying or not. We talked about contradictions one time before. But anyway, the vast majority of the Roman school folks said, yeah, Henry, you're right, this was wrong. Now the Protestant people said, yes, you're right, Henry, you shouldn't have Catherine for your wife, but two wrongs do not make a right. She's your wife now, you keep her.
Right.
Henry went with the Roman idea, and Catherine, who fought tooth and nail, she said, I'm the rightful Queen of England, and she held on, and she was moved different places hither and yon, but she ultimately was dispossessed, and of course Henry married Anne Boleyn. Now I'm not going to get into all the wives of Henry VIII, that's not our point here. It gets weirder as you go along. But Henry, all during this, when he was attempting to get the Pope's permission, he wanted to look good to the Pope. Next slide out. So he had a gentleman under him. This is Cardinal Wolsey. The good Cardinal Wolsey, along with some Jesuits, started burning some heretics at the stake to try to get the Pope to see what a good Catholic Henry was, to annul the marriage that the Pope had approved to Catherine. So Henry, though we want to include him as a reformer, through Wolsey and others, was actually burning Protestants at the stake in England during this whole process. They were being burned there just like they were everywhere else because Henry wanted the Pope to bless his divorce so he could marry Anne.
What about the people who really loved Catherine? How were they handling it?
This was a problem. And that's why ultimately when Wolsey was not effective in getting the Pope's dispensation, guess what happened to Wolsey? So, on the one hand, Henry was a very good king to his people. And even some of the evils, or the vast majority of the evils that he permitted to go on or took part in himself, were with the idea of stabilizing the kingdom. However, it's just like the Roman Church. To say that you're going to root out heresy when you yourselves are the heretics, but when you're going to root out heresy for the sake of the church, well, we've established in here weeks and weeks ago that the church now has nothing to do with Jesus Christ. Nothing. It only has to do with maintaining position and power. That's all it has to do with. And so in that light, if you look at the church that way, you can see it's modeling society in general. The church is behaving the same way the kings are. Now, who taught it to who, I don't know. But that's why, generally speaking, the church backed the kings. Because at this time, all the kings were still Catholic, Roman Catholic. In Germany, the electors, that was a different deal. But all the kings, and why? Because they were kings by divine right, and who crowned them? The Pope, or the Pope's representative. So they're all kind of lined up together. So Wolsey and Henry, finally, Henry got his divorce, and he did not get it with any thanks to the Pope. So Protestantism, or the rules against it in England, were relaxed. They were relaxed. Even though during the particular time, heretics were burned in England just like everywhere else. Come the end of Henry's reign, by this time he'd had 5 other wives, but come the end of Henry's reign, Protestantism was at least accepted, but a form of it. Because Henry never completely overthrew the Catholic Church. Basically, Anglicanism was just a reformulating. What Henry did was Henry said, look, I am king of the country, and that makes me the head of the church in England. Now, the Pope popped a cork over that. But Henry said this was what separated England from the others. Henry said, I don't care if you pop a cork or not. So he started naming bishops. He started reallocating funds, church funds, and all this type of thing, and started relaxing practices within the Roman Church to suit his countrymen. Now again, a lot of the liturgy remained the same, a lot of the external forms remained the same, but at least people weren't dying for their Protestantism.
Was England, Scotland, and Ireland, were they unified at this point?
No. Well, yes and no,
Loosely?
but Scotland their story to Protestantism is a whole different thing. They did not Ireland and Scotland did not move toward Protestantism. In fact, I'm reading about Scotland now in another book, but Scotland is a completely different kettle of fish. They remained Catholic for long after. Not long, say 100 years. But they're a different story, and no, they did not move the same direction as England did when England did.
So Henry VIII was working with that confrontation with Scotland at the same time that
Um,
this was going on?
Scotland was the least of his concerns, generally speaking. Scotland at this time was a really backward country. I mean, it was. Through the
Barbaric.
through the fifth and the Lotharians and the mountainous regions, they were very secluded, and they were not making any effort to disturb England. So Henry had enough on his plate at this time.
And clannish.
Yeah, I mean, extremely
They
clannish.
had their own battles.
Yeah, they had their own stuff going on, and Henry didn't bother them, and they didn't bother Henry. Next slide, please, Al. Now, when Henry died, this gentleman, you may recall the movie from the 30s with Errol Flynn, The Prince and the Pauper, a Mark Twain story. Edward VI was the prince. Basically what had happened, Henry died and left Edward as heir to the throne. Edward was very young, and as a result of that, at a very early age, he spent a lot of his time learning politics, learning how to rule, when kids want to go out and throw a ball. He started very young with regents and counselors on him 24/7. Edward grew up under a fellow named Cranmer. I think that's the next one. This gentleman was a bishop who had turned to the gospel and knew the truth of the word. And he was a very close counselor to young Edward. Edward grew up a staunch Protestant. He grew up granting freedoms of religious belief to all of his subjects. England, for all intents and purposes, was religiously free. Now, one interesting point about whenever this occurs, Protestants never try to get rid of Roman Catholics. It's only been the Roman Catholics that felt like they had to get rid of Protestants. There was no backlash against Catholics, Roman Catholics in England, but every man and woman was granted freedom of conscience to worship as they wished. Now, it didn't hurt any that the king was a Protestant. That didn't hurt anything at all because they were granted protections. Now, what would happen is a lot of cathedrals would all of a sudden become empty because no one was going to Mass anymore. They were all moving to the gospel. So eventually some of those cathedrals would become Protestant churches.
Money went away too, I guess.
Money went away too. In fact, much money was appropriated from church lands because remember, by this time, the Roman Church was enormously wealthy. Not only in money, well, they are today, but not only in money, but in land and property. They were huge landowners. and they received revenue from all of that that got funneled back to Rome, whatever they didn't keep where they were. So all of this started, wait a minute, why am I allowing our money, our English pounds, to go to become lira in Italy, went back when they had lira, when none of it's coming back to prop up our economy. None of it, that stopped. That too put a burr on under the saddle of the Pope. But everything went swimmingly. People were happy. The people were packing out Protestant churches by the thousands. Cathedrals were full. People were standing in the streets to be preached to.
We're not speaking Latin at that point.
No, and it was being delivered in the vernacular. They were hearing it for the first time,
Actually, you hear it in their own language.
and they can actually understand it. It wasn't just a ritual that they were going through. They were being preached to from the Word of God, something we take for granted. For the first time. Well, Wycliffe, of course, had come along, but he'd been dead 100 years, and his Bible was burned 100 years before this. But all that came storming back into England. People were prospering, and it's interesting that, generally speaking, Protestant countries or communities, if they're not undergoing warfare or persecution, are the most prosperous communities in the kingdom. Because they're free. And this is something that we need to bear in mind too. It's kind of a offshoot. But not only was religious liberty something that they were crying for, once they realized there was an alternative to the Roman Church, with religious liberty comes civil liberty. The two go hand in glove. The church, the Roman Church, taught subservience to people and rituals. There's no liberty involved in that at all. You have no choice. You have to do these rituals. You have to do what this guy says. So why would you ever think that it should be different under your king or baron or whoever you lived under? You were expected, because you weren't anybody, you were expected to obey. Christ has a completely different message. Christ says that you are not only important, but I loved you enough, Mr. Plowman, Mr. Carpenter, Mr. Laborer, I loved you enough to die for you. And this is just as available to you as it is to a cardinal in Italy. Intrinsic worth in the human soul, if Christ says I'm worth it, then I must be. So the idea of civil liberty, rights, comes into birth at this time as well. The two go hand in glove. Does that make sense? You see why that would be? The Roman Church didn't want you to have any liberty, because then you're going to cause trouble.
And it takes away their power.
Yeah, you're not going to do what I want you to do. Christ says, I love you all, and I died for you all. It's a different story. Completely different story. Unfortunately, Edward died. Edward died. Poor Edward died. And I guess I should do this, right? Did we ever establish which way I should point?
Is that Mary, Queen of Scots?
No, that's not Mary, Queen of Scots, but it is Mary.
Okay.
This woman is still known in Great Britain as Bloody Mary. And it ain't no drink they're talking about.
Now, who is she married to?
Mary wasn't married.
Where's she from?
I gotta look at that face.
What's her lineage?
She's from the line of the Tudors. She was from Francis and so forth. I don't remember if she was their granddaughter or what. I think she was their granddaughter. She was a daughter of Catherine's. Remember Catherine?
Catherine of Aragon.
Yeah. She was a daughter of Catherine's, and she became the heir to Edward VI.
But she wasn't Henry VIII's Catherine.
Yeah.
Okay, that
Yeah.
was Henry VIII her dad? Okay, okay.
Yeah. It's hard to keep straight because
Was she the half-sister or the sister of Elizabeth? Half-sister?
half-sister.
Yes.
Mary, on the other hand, was a Catholic. Not just any Catholic, but a hardcore Catholic or nothing Catholic. Everything that Edward and Cranmer had brought about in the kingdom, she instantly, upon ascension to the throne, meant to destroy. And she did a great job, because as I mentioned, to this day, she is referred to as Bloody Mary in England. Next slide, Al. Or is this where it,
Yep.
yeah. I'll let you get there.
Bear with me.
Yeah. Mary contacted the Pope. There was a gentleman that was residing in Italy as a cardinal named Reginald Pole. Reginald Pole was one of those guys that will do what you just think about. So Mary had what she needed to get rid of Protestantism in England. Now there were still a lot of Catholics in England, don't misunderstand me, but Protestantism had been lawfully accepted and droves of people were turning to Protestantism. There were still plenty of Catholics in England, just like there was anywhere else. So the Jesuits and Mr. Reginald Pole, Mary specifically asked for Reginald. She wrote to the Pope and said, I am going to give you back England to the Roman Church. I need Reginald Pole. Now, I don't know what she knew about Reginald that we don't know. The Pope said, thank you very much, he's on his way. The Pope at that time was Julius III, by the way. But this went on and on and on. Hundreds, including Cranmer, who had helped Edward VI, and some fellows that he knew, Horn, Sedgwick, another group that we haven't talked about, all of them were sent to the stake. All of them. And every Protestant that they could round up that was worshiping, they too went to the stake. They were beheaded. They were tortured before to give up other names. Anyone who may have been at a service, anyone who may have owned a Bible in the vernacular, in the common tongue. Anyone who may have bought or looked at one of Luther's books that had by this time been printed in English and come to England. Anyone and everyone went to the stake. Fires were blazing over England. It was incredible. It was incredible.
What time period was Joan of Arc?
Joan of Arc was 300 years before this,
Uh,
300 years. Thus Mary and Reginald Pole. The final turning point of this incredible ordeal the church refused to lose England because by this point there was so much turmoil in Europe in general that they felt like if they lost England, the church would be lost. Mary, praise God, died, as we all do eventually, before she could stamp out the fire of Protestantism completely. She tried, she came close, but she died. And her sister Elizabeth, her half-sister Elizabeth, she, by the way, was the daughter of Henry and Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth came to the throne. There were some people who wanted to debate this, whether she was the rightful heir, because of all this that went on between Henry and Catherine and the Pope, and whether and Anne Boleyn by this point had been beheaded. But the people proclaimed Elizabeth queen. And so she ascended to the throne. Elizabeth, for all of her quirks, and she had a few, was probably the greatest monarch that ever sat on the throne of England. She had a lot to go through because she came in the middle of two warring parties. And she was adamant about restoring Protestantism. But she did not want to do it. It was kind of like Abraham Lincoln. He wanted to free the slaves, but he was not going to destroy the nation to do it. It had to be the right time and the right place and the right way. She wanted to bring Protestantism permanently back to England. But she knew she had to do it in the right way. Elizabeth was super smart or super blessed, one or the other. But she knew at the beginning she needed wise counselors that could thread their way through the labyrinth of what had become English politics. And she was enormously successful in choosing wise counselors. And she navigated, with their help, all that needed to be done without generating a civil war to bring Protestantism back legally and firmly and forever to England. Now, the Pope, and by this time Philip II and Philip's uncle Ferdinand, realized that Elizabeth was serious about this. She was going to make it happen. So they kept sending her letters, even though they were, of course, Catholic, and they knew what Elizabeth was doing. I'm sure Elizabeth knew they knew. They kept sending her letters of, "We love you, babe. You know, look, we got your back. We truly do. Okay, we don't agree, but that's your country. We wish you the best.
Yeah.
No ill will on our part." There were letters the Pope wrote to the Jesuits. Some are still in existence, where the Jesuits were authorized to infiltrate England and assassinate Elizabeth using any means possible. They came into the country disguised as merchants. They came into the country disguised as Protestants. They came in disguised in any manner of ways to get close enough to Elizabeth to kill her. That was authorized by the Pope. In addition to that, Philip, in spite of all of his protestations to the contrary about appreciating Elizabeth and all that, was busy building the greatest armada of ships that the world has ever seen, the Spanish Armada. He was doing that with one purpose in mind. He also had a fellow up in the Netherlands who had been subdued for a while at this point. One of the greatest generals of his age, his name was Parma. You don't hear about this as much. The Spanish Armada was rapidly being built in Spain. And these shipworks were so big and so busy that you couldn't hide what was going on. I mean, England knew an armada was being built. Philip knew that as hard as he tried, that secret could not be kept. And he said, "Oh, Elizabeth, we got some problems over in the Americas, and I really got to get these guys over there. No worries. That's what they're meant for." And of course, a lot of people in England wanted to believe that, because they had had enough trouble in their own backyard, so to speak. But the building went on. In the meantime, General Parma, up in the Netherlands, was building a like fleet in the Netherlands. Not quite as big, not the same kind of ships. A lot of them were flat bottom to get troops ferried across the English Channel. But he was building that on the harbors near the German Ocean, up there in the Netherlands. The idea was that these two fleets, and there were like 50,000 soldiers being trained and billeted to be ferried over, was they were going to conquer England and take it back for the Pope. Period. So they thought they were lulling Elizabeth to sleep. The Armada was finally finished in 1588, and it sailed up the Atlantic for England, for the English Channel. It got to the English Channel. It's a very interesting story. I'm not going to go through it all. There you go. One more, Al. Oh, Philip II, I'm sorry. I didn't show Charles V. I think we did one other week. But all these guys look the same.
You said that the last time.
Yeah, well, that was Calvin and Wycliffe and those guys. What's the last slide here? I got my little sheet here. That was Pope Sixtus. That,
Same.
I mean,
The,
you can trust me, right?
Ugly son.
But the last slide is of the Armada. Obviously, it's an artist rendering. But if you can see in the background, it's not real easy. There were literally hundreds of ships of war. Hundreds. England had nothing that could touch this. Nothing. Nothing at all. I mean, their navy may have comprised 40 ships of the line, is what these were called, and some privateers. Some guys, they were guys with smaller boats that they armed, that the king, or in this case Queen Elizabeth, licensed to fight, but they were their own captains. These guys were coming up the fort, and that's not even talking about Parma, that's going to come down from the Netherlands. They make it to the English Channel. Make it to the English Channel, and they're sitting there, anchored off Calais. The reason they're anchored off Calais, well, by the way, on their way up, they ran through a couple of severe storms, very severe storms. Now, it hardly made a difference in their numbers, but it did sink some of their ships and the fleet was scattered. But they reassembled, made it to Calais on the coast of France, and they were anchored there. The Spanish admiral, Mendoza, expected Parma to rendezvous with him at Calais. Then they were going to go across the channel and raise Cain. And they would hit several different, because the English had no army that could meet that number at 2 or 3 different points along the coast. I mean, it was a done deal. I can't emphasize that enough. This was a done deal. England was no more. Parma never showed up. Mendoza waited. He waited. Finally, one of the Queen's privateers, Francis Drake, had the idea that we can't fight these guys, although they did skirmish them up and down the English Channel, and they sunk a few ships. They did it. I mean, they were willing. They said, if these guys turn west to come across the channel, we're done. We all know it. They got a lot of different sized boats, loaded them with pitch and tar and gunpowder.
Oh,
And when the winds were right, they lit them on fire and sent them to the east across the channel.
caught the other boats on fire.
Of the 40,000 some odd sailors and soldiers that left Cadiz, Spain, on the Armada, less than 10,000 made it home. And the Armada was no more, and Philip had bankrupted Spain to make this happen. Now, if you can't see the hand of God in that, because there was no way, humanly speaking, that the English could have fought this off. There was no way. And they didn't. But not one, well, I take that back. There was another storm, and some Spaniards did in fact make it to the coast. But their shipwreck caused them to wash up on the shore, and rather than invading, they were begging surrender. And the English took them in and fed them and clothed them and sent them back to Spain. Where you wonder if it would have been the other way around if the troops had actually landed on the English shore. And thus, Philip goes down in flames, Spain goes down in flames, and England and Elizabeth are secure. And Protestantism is secure in England. There are a couple of side notes that I'd like to make about our friends, the Jesuits. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV disbanded the Jesuits. He said, no, we don't need you boys anymore. In 1814, Pope Pius VII reestablished them by popular demand. Now it's kind of like it seems to me, one of those advertisements where it says, many professionals promote this product. Well, whose popular demand? Who?
Yeah.
But they were reestablished. Ignatius, the founder of this rot, and plague upon Europe and the Far East for generations, was canonized in 1622. He was made a saint. Now Xavier went on his own way. Again, he was not a friend to any Protestant where he ran into them, but to my knowledge, he was never involved in the mass extinction or the attempted mass extinction of Protestants in Europe. He was not involved in that. But to this day, there are Jesuit universities in this country. Xavier University, Loyola University, they're in existence to this day.
Is Notre Dame one of them?
No, Notre Dame is just a Catholic university, a Roman Catholic university. There may be others, but those are two that come to my mind. Just like Brigham Young is a Mormon college. What's fascinating to me, and I didn't spend a lot of time, I freely admit that, just for giggles, because so much of what I've done has been reading and studying, not on the internet, because I don't trust the internet. But just for fun, I went on some Jesuit websites. And they identified themselves as Jesuit websites. I went on one that said, "Who we are." The only mention that I could find on that particular website, there may be others that are different, I freely acknowledge that, but on this official Jesuit website, the only mention of the Protestant Reformation and the multitude of atrocities that they committed was during the time of the Reformation, the church or society was in chaos, and the Jesuits provided spiritual comfort to thousands.
It's called rewriting history.
Well, they may have provided spiritual comfort to thousands of Roman Catholics, but they didn't provide spiritual comfort to Protestants. But there was no mention of it. None. The reason we need to know these things, and the reason we need to be cautious, and I know we're in church, but I don't know how else to say this, we need BS detectors. And we need to keep them in shape and finely tuned. Because when push comes to shove, the Jesuits, in their minds, are not wrong. They were doing what Holy Mother Church needed to have done at the time, in their minds. In the minds of the Holy Roman Church, they did not commit any atrocities. They did what needed to be done to protect, maintain, and sustain their organization. And when you can skew your way of thinking that way, you can make an excuse for anything.
Isn't that essentially what's going on now across the board?
Ah.
Not just in the Catholic circles, but
Sure.
politically.
Well,
They
politically,
just keep saying the lie over and over and over until the lie becomes the truth.
well, Lenin said, repeat a lie often enough, and the masses will believe it.
I think Saul Alinsky did too.
Yeah. I mean, it's the way it's done. And here, we talked about this months ago in our other class. There is no value any longer on the truth. The search for truth is not what is sought after in our schools and universities. The promoting of an agenda or a particular worldview is how they are being conditioned. The Jesuits, when they came along, did open schools. They did open hospitals. But guess what the schools taught? The infallibility of the Pope, the need to perform the sacraments to have a hope of going to heaven, the obeisance to Pope and Bishop and priest, the need for confession to a priest to go to heaven. That's what they taught. So, if that's the case, are they to be commended for those schools? It's just like all the really nice people that ride in the white shirts and blue slacks from the Mormons. They ride the bicycles and they're committed to sharing and going out. But if you're sending people to hell by them buying into what you're selling, are you to be commended for that?
Earthly. That's earthly commentation. That's from people on earth commending them.
Well,
God
well, no, of course not.
Yeah.
Of course. You're
It's
absolutely
just
right.
people, yeah.
But I mean,
They commend them for their building up of the family and
Yeah.
stuff, but totally
Sure.
miss the fact that they're
well,
bringing people to hell in the
and
process.
Kathy, I'll go a step beyond that. You're absolutely right. But I'd be willing to bet, and this is not an indictment on anyone or any situation, but I'll be willing to bet that the vast majority of the everyday Mormon
Must be there.
does not know any more about what they actually profess to believe than the average Christian. Because I really believe that the vast majority of Mormons, just like you said, buy in, because it's wonderful, buy into the family values of the Mormons.
Yeah.
And it is. It's a wonderful thing. The parents are commanded to spend one-on-one time with their kids every evening. They have big family outings. It's good stuff. I doubt that most of those people realize that according to Mormonism, there are millions of gods, that Joseph Smith was given a revelation that went beyond the Bible by the angel Moroni. I doubt they know any of that
Baptized for babies in heaven.
because they're involved in worldly stuff just like we are. So if this is good, I'll take it for the good that's in it and forget about the rest. I don't need to know that. My family has support. My kids have great wholesome things to do. I don't care about the rest of it. So, anyway, more on that later. I have a question. Any questions about tonight, what we went over tonight? And are you sorry that I took a minute to go back through England and...
No.
Okay, good.
I got a question.
Yes, sir.
Why didn't Parma show up?
What happened to him?
Parma had his own problems in the Netherlands. You're going to love this, Al. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
Parma didn't have an outlet to the sea.
He had all these boats and no way to...
He built everything on the German Ocean, but guess what? He had to pass through the Danish Straits to get to the ocean, and the Danes wouldn't let him out.
Did the English have anything to do with that? Did Elizabeth have anything to do with it?
I don't know.
Was there some kind of...
Well, the Danes were struggling Protestants, so I suspect, I don't know if there were, I don't know if she had any direct communication with them. I don't know.
But the fact that they were Protestant and this guy's
But they were on the
purpose was
same
to-
side.
Yeah.
They were on the same side. But it was incredible because you can have all those ships and all those boats and soldiers,
But, you gotta
but if
be-
you have to go under the guns of a narrow strait, he sat in the Netherlands. He just sat there. He never, For all I know, the boats were left to rot. And if you could go up there and do excavations, they may still be there, I don't know. He couldn't get to the sea.
Are you following any of that Drain the Oceans that they're doing on National Geographic?
Yeah, a little bit, but
They're finding those ships that everywhere, like off of
Oh.
LA. They're finding ships that were sunk during the,
there are thousands of ships at the bottom of the ocean.
just recently they've been able to do things like that to find
Yeah.
what's down there.
This is kind of a rabbit trail, and we need to go, but, I have a lot of admiration for National Geographic and their photography and their production, on some things.
But they push,
Other things, not so
they
much.
push evolution big time.
Yeah, they are a science organization, and for example, they had a series on, this was some years ago, on faith, on the church. It's completely cockeyed. I mean, it was basically what the underachieving student wants to believe because they don't know any better. That's the way it was presented. You know, but their wildlife stuff is really cool. Their oceanography and those exploration,
Photography's beautiful.
very cool. They have the best photographers in the world,
Absolutely.
hands down.
Well, they've got the equipment
Oh yeah,
for doing that draining and so forth like that. That's ultrasound
Yeah.
and so forth.
it's. I mean,
Oh.
but again, if you fault them for their agenda, you're faulting 90% of what's going on in the world today. But I have one other question, then we'll pray and go. After we finish this, I'm going to take some time, let you all take some time also. I would like to do, the next class I would like to do on religions, denominations, and cults. Just to get a feel for what's what, even within Protestant denominations. And we'll also talk about some of the weird stuff, and then some of those that are very popular in America today that are cults. Do you all think, because you have been the backbone, do you all think it would be best to wait until fall? Or would you like to take a month or so and then start late summer? What do you think?
Are you still doing the study in Romans?
We're gonna talk about that because we're gonna do a rewind.
Okay.
And I'm not sure what that's gonna look like yet. Because I know Brian and Kathleen have been very kind about letting us come, and we've had some good conversations over there. But what I'm thinking is Brian, he's got to make hay in summertime. It gets a little dicey whether he wants to come out of the field and take a shower and do it or not. And it's,
Yeah, take a shower.
well,
You
I don't know why you start now, but, and Kathleen, I'm sure, she's a farm wife and she's involved in a lot of that too. So what I'm thinking about is giving them a break and they can come when they're able, but moving it to the Thousand Hills Coffee Shop. Because they would allow us to meet in there. And as a general rule, I don't think we're gonna have more than 6 or 8 unless something comes. So that's what I'm thinking about doing. It's just moving the location and then we can get a decent cup of coffee while we're there too. For
Oh,
those
we
who
have
like.
great desserts.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
really do.
So that's what I'm thinking about, but as of this Thursday, we're not gonna meet. Like I say, and I'll be perfectly frank with this. We're gonna do a survey this Sunday, we're gonna do it next. Whether it's something that we're doing or We are woefully uninvolved in small groups as a church body. And we cannot grow in the love of God that we are called to grow into if we are only interested enough in God to show up 1 hour a week. Now, I'm sorry, I am under the same indictment, okay? I'm not pointing fingers at anyone. But something's got to change.
Yeah.
And so my goal is that as a result of the survey information I get, it's my job to look at that and pull together what people say they want or need. And I'm hoping they'll say they want or need something.
Well, it's kind of like the Zimboskis. They want more of a social
Sure.
interaction and discussion about common everyday things that are going on.
Yeah, and that's
terrific,
great.
Yeah.
But if I get 2 or 3 other people that say they'd like that, then I can get them together.
Right.
And that's a small group.
And that's a small group, and presumably God will come into the conversation somewhere,
Right.
but that's a good thing. If people say they want a more in-depth Bible study, but they want it off-site in the morning because they can't come in the evening because they've got little kids still at home or whatever the case may be, fine, let me know that, and we'll put something together. So that's what, as a result of this survey, they should be in the bulletins next week, or Johnny and Wayne handing them out as you come in. During the service, we're going to ask people to fill them out. I know people hate surveys, that's why I said let's do it during the service.
Best time to get everybody.
Yeah, and then just answer it honestly. It's going to be very simple, 3-4 questions, yes, no, and then what do you want? And then I'm going to take the first month or 2 of the summer to collate that information and then reach out with other interested parties to see what we can do to get more people involved.
That conference that Rob and I went to yesterday, and Vicki went also, really encourages to do it away from the church,
Mhm.
so that we can get other denominational people or other unchurched people to come to that for the social aspect of it, but then introduce Christianity.
Well, and that's why I was thinking about Thousand Hills. Because if you're sitting in the back there, I don't care if there are only 4 of us that show up, 6 or 8 people, and somebody's going to hear us. Somebody's going to hear us.
Yeah.
And my personal opinion is, we're not doing anybody a world of good if we're not out there sharing Jesus. Now we may be satisfied that we're saved and we know where we're going. That's not what Jesus died telling us to do. He said, once you know me, you should be full of love and joy and wanting to share that with others. Now it may be happening, but I don't know who's doing it. And that includes me. So anyway, that's the goal. I'm hoping to find, with y'all's help, because I feel like everybody here has stayed the course and are interested enough to be here. So we may have some other conversations about this. Okay? I can't do it alone. Hey, and I need all the help I can get. Lord knows I can't even run a clicker. All right, I'm sorry I kept you this long. Let's have a word of prayer and go home and enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening. Lord, thank you so much. There are horrible things that have been committed where unbelievers want to say they were committed in your name. That's a lie, Lord. There have been a lot of horrible things committed. There have been some horrible things committed by the church. But never, ever has it been done in your name. Help us to know as much as we can know. Help us to care enough to want to know as much as we can. Help us to think and realize it's more important than our golf game, or a football game, or whatever the case may be. And when this life is over, and as much as we, all of us, may have ignored what you wanted us to do, it's going to be too late to stand in front of you and make an excuse of why we didn't. So help us to get that energy. Help us to feel it. A lot of us don't. Much of the time, I don't have a lot of energy left. But I know you can fuel me. You can fuel us all. And in the time we have left that you grant us, we can make a difference. And while we know what the book says, we know how it's all going to turn out, don't let us be complacent about that. Help us to be found doing your work when you come. In Jesus' name, amen.